I think you'll like my next guest. Her name is Barbara Ferguson, and she has a really interesting story to tell that's both sobering, upsetting, yet at the same time it's also very affirming. Now, if your church is anything like ours, during the announcements you'll often hear something like, "Bill and Mary are coming home from the mission field on furlough." For years I thought that meant they'd been living in a paddock somewhere, but I know better now. Anyway, the thing is that we often support missionary couples, but if truth be told, rarely do we get to know them. Well, cue my next guest. Barbara Ferguson is one of those missionaries. She'd been in Southeast Asia for many years, but she was back living in Australia when a friend told her about a story in the Sydney paper that changed her life. She knew she had to do something. So for the last 13 years, she's been travelling and missioning in Africa. But here's the thing. 13 years ago, Barbara was 67. Work that out. I went to Australia to meet and to chat and began by asking her about her age, something that you should never ask a woman, but Barbara didn't blink an eyelid. She was on a mission. At 67, Barbara, I'd be wanting to sit down, put my feet up and read a good book and not have to bother about doing it. So what was it about this story that made you say, I had to do something?
Well, it was just that I was overwhelmed by the stories that I was reading about the brutality that was being practiced on the bodies of so many women in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and that I'd never heard about this. So it was partly that I was so shocked by what was happening to women, but you know, there was something else to it. And that was when I was 8 years old, I went to a Christian camp, and I was a very lonely child, and I was the only 8-year-old at that camp. The other children were all older than I was. And I felt my loneliness because they knew each other. But the Sunday night at the church, the young catechist who got up and preached, he talked about Livingstone and his work in Africa. And he said that he was never alone, he was never afraid because, and he quoted from Matthew 28, "Go into all the world and preach the gospel, and lo, I'm with you to the end of the world." That was the translation in those days. And as a child, I thought, if I go to Africa, I'll never be alone. And I promised there and then to go to Africa, but I'd forgotten all about it, and I went to Vietnam. But at that stage in my life, 67, I was looking for a new source of meaning. And here it was. And it was like God saying, pay your vow.
Well, let's go back a few years. How did you end up in Vietnam?
I had volunteered to go anywhere in the world with the Church Missionary Society, the Anglican Missionary Society, and I was in theological college studying at Moore College through Deaconess House in Sydney, and I was editing the magazine and I came across something, and again it was like the body blow, go to Vietnam. And CMS wasn't working in Vietnam, but the World Council of Churches was. And I found it again in the Sydney Morning Herald. Fairfax Media has a lot to answer for in my life. But I went off to Vietnam and I was there for 8 years.
I can imagine you reading that article and saying, yes, I must do something. But there's a difference between feeling in the moment and then actually physically going and doing it.
I didn't think at first that I would do much more than meet with Congolese women and perhaps do some advocacy for them, some advocacy with the United Nations. But I met a couple of women who were refugees in Sydney. And then one day I heard a woman from Congo, from Goma, speaking on the radio, and it seemed to me she was at a hospital in this city, and I managed to get in touch with her and I said, look, I've done this and that in my life. I've worked with rape survivors from South Vietnam. Is there any way I could help you in the hospital? And she just, it actually was via email, and she just sent back one word, come.
And at that point you knew?
I knew that it was right in God's plan.
And how long from that time till you actually arrived with these people?
Oh, there was a lot of bureaucracy to get through, and so it was almost 2 years before I actually arrived at the border of Congo.
And what did they think when they saw you? Here's this white Australian woman.
Well, I was fortunate in that some wonderful Australian medical personnel from Brisbane had been going to the hospital for a couple of years. A wonderful surgeon who does miracle surgery, Neil Wetzick, and his wife Gwen had been going, so they weren't surprised to see me. And I'd been communicating with the public relations officer for the hospital, Mama Virginie, and Virginie is a very good friend now. She met me at the border, and I thought, this is wonderful. I've got a friend in this strange place.
What did you think you were going to do?
Well, at that stage, the plan was that I would train the counsellors at the hospital to work with the rape survivors. I mean, the rape was not just rape, it was rape torture. Evelyn was a young woman. She was 16 years old when she was living with the Pygmies in a village, and she and two other young women, also teenagers, went to the forest to gather water and firewood, and they were set upon by a group of men, and they said, "We want to rape you. Will you agree?" And Evelyn's, in telling me the story, she said, "I thought, why should I die? I know so many women, when they struggle, they're killed." And so they all agreed to the rape. She thought that she'd actually come off okay because the girl who had the breast cut off, she died of her wounds. But Evelyn found out that she was pregnant, and this thing that seemed so terrible in her life actually turned out to be wonderful, because all things work together for good to them that love God and do His will. And she was sent to the hospital, and the woman that I'd heard on the radio, Lynn recognised that this young woman had something special, and she ensured that she learnt to be a literacy teacher. So Evelyn came back to join the people that at that stage I was working with, and we met and we become very good friends, and she now runs our child care program.
So where does forgiveness fit in with all of that? Because I would imagine if that happened to somebody I loved, I don't know, even knowing what I'm supposed to do as a Christian, whether I could forgive. I don't know.
Well, when I've been training the counsellors, this is a big issue. We have to talk about forgiveness, because initially one of the things that I learnt from the counsellors was that they were saying to the rape survivors, you have to forgive, you know. We say, forgive us our sin as we forgive those who sin against us. And the women say, how can we forgive? How can we forgive God for letting this happen to us?
That's a good question.
And so I had to talk with them about, this is a process, forgiveness is a process, and you can't expect a woman to say, you know, it's human. You've had this dreadful thing done to you and you want revenge, and yet there's no way to get revenge. But I also think something else happens in that situation. It's like, you know, I'm always amazed at the resilience of people too, because if there's no alternative and you don't have an option, and people don't talk all the time about your mental health and how we have to look after your mental health, you either get on with it or you go crazy. And so there's a degree of resilience in those people.
So that was a happy ending for Evelyn then?
For Evelyn, it's a wonderful ending, and she is just, she's a shining light in the village. I have implicit trust in her. She is a mother to the children. And because so many people in the village, they've come out of the forest, they're Stone Age people, and
Stone Age, so we're talking about pygmies here, are we?
We're talking about pygmies. Evelyn was a pygmy. Initially I was talking about the ordinary Bantu, the ordinary people, but the pygmies are the people that I'm now working almost exclusively with.
Can you define what makes a pygmy?
Well, the pygmies are the forest people, the people who anthropologists think that about 20 to 30,000 years ago, these people fled into the forest. They were probably the first peoples, the Aboriginals of that area of Central Africa. And because they were in the forest, and I've been in the forest to have a sense of what it would be like to live in there, and I tell you, it was very difficult. I actually thought I was going to die in the forest, but they have worked out a unique way of life, and it's very beautiful, their understanding of the forest, and but it's a dangerous life. Nothing is easy in making your living in the forest. Plus, you're not getting enough sunlight and so on. And so the supposition is that people have developed some sort of genetic inherited mutation that makes them immune to human growth hormone, so that when they're 12 years of old, they don't grow anymore. So they're mature at 12 years of age.
And how tall are they? Yeah.
Well, they're between 4 to 5 foot. So some of the men, the men from the forest, would be almost as tall as me. The women mostly, and a lot of the men would just come up to my shoulder. But what's happening is, with this generation that have grown up outside of the forest, they are actually growing. So I'm not so sure about the mutation in the resistance to the human growth hormone.
Can you imagine if the three of us stood together?
Ah, yes.
Yeah. Where does God fit into all of this? Were there times in the forest there when you saw these terrible things, when you just asked God why?
No. There's evil in the world. You know, yeah, no, I know it's not God's will. I know that these are the least of his people. These are the most disadvantaged, the most persecuted, the most discriminated against, and these are the ones that Jesus told us to love. He loved them. And I'm quite sure that in doing the work that I'm doing with them, I'm his person to them.
And were they interested in hearing about God? Because I presume they hadn't heard of God, right?
Well, interestingly, they had, because the Congo, because of the Belgian influence, is a Christian country in many ways. The Pygmies were not. God was the forest. They said, the forest is our Father God. He gives us everything. He gives us food, he gives us clothing, he gives us shelter, he looks after us. If bad things happen to us, it's because the forest, our Father, is sleeping. So we must sing and dance to wake him gently.
So what did you do to answer that?
Well, they actually said to me that the women particularly, had heard about Jesus. And they actually asked me for a church, and I said I can't build a church. Now, the money that I raise to fund the programs we have going is tax deductible, and the Australian government has the regulation that it cannot be used for religious or political purposes. But we built a centre, and I said you can have this as a place to worship on Sundays. And I actually personally have found a lay preacher who goes out every Sunday, and he's trying to bring up some of the people to take over that service. Yeah.
One of the things that would worry me is that you are seeing all these little children, and they're obviously in such need. They must look upon you as a beacon of hope. Let me just finish my thought here. Many years ago, my wife and I adopted a little child from Brazil, and we had to go to an orphanage and spend some time there before we were allowed to leave. And one of the most terrible moments of my life was the day that we left, and another little girl holding onto my leg and trying to come with me. And it was just such an upsetting moment that even 28 years later I can still remember, and it physically upsets me. You must have seen way worse.
Yes. It's always hard to leave, I have to say. And I always think, oh, maybe this is the last time. And, you know, many people here say to me, Barbara, you're old. You know, I'm in my 80th year. And they say, why are you doing this to yourself? And, you know, it's the children. And it's the fact that 3 out of 10 children, when I first became involved with this group, 3 out of 10 children would die before they were 2 years of age. Now the children, in fact, we're doing, it's actually making the work more difficult in some ways, because children aren't dying, they're living, and they're healthier. And just to see the difference between the photos of the children when I first met them and the photos of the children now. I had someone accompany me last visit in April, and she said, oh, look at all these children, they're healthy, Barbara, they're healthy. And that's wonderful, you know, but I know that there's so much more to do.
I heard, and you can tell me whether this is true or not, that the Pygmies, that in Africa, until recently, people deliberately went out and killed them.
Well,
this
is in the past, this has happened because they were considered to be just bushmeat, like the monkeys and the other small animals in the forest. And the government actually in 2013, they introduced legislation to protect the pygmies.
So this is 2013, this is not many years ago.
I don't know if, I mean, I have never heard of I've never met anyone who says that they've eaten pygmy, but I have heard the stories that this happened. And, you know, there's a lot of brutality in that part of the world.
And now that you're nearly 80, so you've been doing this for 13, 14 years.
Well, yeah, I've been going, 10 years I've been going there, 11 visits.
Are you going to stop soon?
I'll stop when God tells me. I feel that while I still can go, I must go. But I do have a contingency plan that might come about in the near future, where I'll be able to continue but not have to make the long trip.
I guess for the people that are there, though, you've made such a huge difference. The mountain that they live on, I read it in the book, is it S-H-O-V-E, Mount?
Yeah, Mount Shove.
Yeah,
yes.
And I want to say Shove, right?
Yes.
And I found it quite ironic that these poor people were shoved off their own mountain. It just struck me as being incredibly ironic. That was the name of the mountain. Are they ever going to be allowed back to their land?
I think there's no possibility of that, because while part of the reason they're out of the forest is for security reasons, especially this group of pygmies in this area of Goma, there are other pygmies in other parts of Congo who are allowed back to the forest because they were the conservers of the forest, and so they have a role. They're allowed to go back as long as they don't kill the monkeys and the gorillas and so on. But these people are right on the border between Rwanda, Burundi and Congo, and that is the area where the people who perpetuated the genocide in Rwanda have come across into that area. And the government says anyone in the forest is with the rebels. So 3 of our pygmy men last year went into the forest because that's what they know. When there's unemployment, there's no industry, there's no tourists, people have to survive on their wits, and the pygmies are in competition with all the rest of the population. So what do they know? They know going back to the forest to make charcoal. They know go back to the forest to gather wood. They know go back to the forest to get nuts and roots and so on, and small animals. So they go back. 3 of them were captured, we thought dead, lost. And then it turned out that they had also captured a couple of the Bantu, the ordinary people, had also been captured. And one was such an old man who was so ill that they let him go from the prison because they thought he was going to die. But he made his way back to Mubambiro, and he said, there's 3 pygmy men who are being held. They're beaten, they're starving, they don't feed us more than once every couple of days. And I had an attorney, a lawyer, and he, brave man, with the mother of one of the young men who was captured and another pygmy man, trekked back 200 kilometres or so to this prison and managed to get 2 of them out. But one of them had a machete with them, and so they said he was joining the rebels, and so they haven't released him. So going back to your question, I'm sorry, the going into the forest for security reasons, they're not allowed to go back. But the other reason is that the government really wants to make it tourism there, to go and see the mountain gorillas, because that would be wonderful. If there was security, tourism could come in and that would make money for the country. The other thing is that charcoal, because there's no power in the area, charcoal burning for cooking it's a very big, a huge multi-million-dollar business, and that has been taken over by big companies. So they don't want the small charcoal making by the Pygmies.
I have another question, and this has been worrying me for some time after reading the title of your book, Don't Look Away, Don't. What is it in our psyche, in the Western world, that we don't want to deal with this? Why do we look away?
A difficult question. I know that there are some stories that I can't watch, so I understand that. I think because people feel helpless and hopeless. Of Africa, it's another basket case, you know, what can we do? And that's where I feel I've got something to share with people. I go around and I speak at clubs and churches, wherever I'm invited I go, like I came up here today, because I can make a difference. It's only a few people. It's a small village, 140 children and maybe 100 or so individual adults. But we're making a difference. As I said, these children are no longer malnourished. They're getting a basic education. They're learning French. They're learning about rights. This Evelyn, she integrates, along with the usual things you learn when you're in preschool, she integrates the idea that you have rights. She's teaching them that about self-esteem, that they stand up straight and they talk. They speak French. Now, their parents didn't even speak, a lot of them didn't even speak Swahili. Swahili and French in that part of Congo are the official languages. If you can't speak French and Swahili, there's no hope for you. If you can't handle numbers and so on, you can't handle even small trading, which is how most people survive. So these children have got a future. They've got a hope.
The book is quite difficult to read.
Oh, is it? I'm sorry.
Well, no, not in the sense that it's because it's very well written. It's difficult because it becomes emotionally difficult to read. It touches your heart. Mm. So in 2019, 2020, 2021, what can we do?
Well, one, if you're a Christian and you pray, please pray, because I'm so conscious of prayer supporting everything that we do. But also, if you want to help, you can make a donation. And if someone, I mean, it would be wonderful to have someone who spoke French, who was perhaps a kindergarten teacher, who had the financial capacity to make the trip to Congo. I would love to take someone else with me on my next trip.
Well, I don't speak French. I'm certainly not a kindergarten teacher, but Barbara, it's been an honour to meet you and to hear your story. God bless you.
He does.
Can I give you a hug?
Yes. Thank you.